Most of our viewers have migrated over from our main audio production YouTube channel, so you may be new to video production. If you've just bought a camera but everything looks a bit like this and you can't work out the settings, then this video is for you. It's fair to say that most people are happy working with a fully automatic camera, a point and shoot, for making videos, whether it's for YouTube content or it's going elsewhere. Be it a compact digital camera with video capability or the latest iPhone, you can get decent results using a device that's doing the hard work for you, and it will get you somewhere in the ballpark. But what if you're someone who won't just settle for decent? You want better video, but you're not sure what all the settings on your new camera actually mean. Starting right at the beginning, let's discuss focus. All cameras have some form of focus, whether it's automatic or manual, and this controls which area of the image captured by the camera is clearest and sharpest. Manual focusing is the method used by photographers and videographers for many years before the technology existed to aid them. But even now, some situations still call for manual focus, cinematography being one of them. If you're on a multi-million-pound film shoot for Jurassic Park and you can't focus on the dinosaur because the autofocus has decided that a tree in the background is much more interesting than what's going on in the foreground, then you're in for a struggle. With manual focus, the camera operator, or on larger productions, the dedicated operator for focus pulling, which is the action of changing the focus on a camera, can determine exactly what is in focus on the camera at all times. This means that you can always be accurate with the focusing, and you can also achieve stylized shots, such as those in which the focus slowly moves along an object, either to slowly reveal details or to give the item an expensive look, and can be used creatively to direct the viewer's eye when you want their attention shifted from one point of the frame to another. Autofocus has two main subcategories: single or one-shot autofocus and continuous autofocus. On the Blackmagic Pocket 6K, the camera we use to film these very videos, you can find single autofocus. This camera is designed to be manually focused, but the single autofocus can get you into the ballpark before shooting. The camera analyzes the shot and determines the point of the focal range, which gives the sharpest and most contrasted image, and sets it to that. However, once this has been done, the camera won't automatically adjust focus to stay in focus for the rest of the video sequence. That is the job of the camera operator. If you need a camera that does all the work for you, then continuous autofocus is your friend. As it says in the name, the camera will constantly analyze what it's capturing and adjust the focus in real time to maintain the sharpest image at all times. This is found on most smaller point-and-shoot cameras, as well as on mobile phones, as they're designed for a very hands-off approach. However, some cameras give you the option to choose between a single or continuous autofocus. Many models from Canon and Sony feature superb autofocus, which is fast, accurate, and can make shooting much easier when you need to be hands-off, for example if using a gimbal or crane. And even the semi-pro videographers have started using it in many cases just to make life easier. Zoom is the next important factor to learn the basics of. When you look at the exterior of photography or cinematography lenses, you'll see lots of numbers written around the zoom ring, measurements in millimeters. The higher the number, the more zoomed in the lens will be. The measurement isn't the actual length of the lens, but rather a calculation of an optical distance from the point where light rays converge in the lens to form a sharp image of an object to the digital sensor at the focal plane in the camera. On a prime lens, there's only one focal length. You cannot zoom in or out. The image is fixed at one length. These lenses are often used in cinematography where there are many known constants and everything can be planned and measured before shooting. On a zoom lens, you can adjust the focal length to zoom in or zoom out. Zoom lenses will have a fixed range of focal lengths, some ranging from 18 to 35mm, some from 55 to 250, and on some really expensive lenses, quite often found on broadcast cameras, huge focal length ranges can be achieved, meaning you don't need a range of different lenses to cover different zoom ranges. Next up, we move on to the settings found on the physical camera body, starting with ISO or gain. Two names for the same thing. ISO is one of the three elements used to control exposure. We'll come to the other two shortly. The ISO is used to denote how sensitive your camera's sensor is to the available light. The lower the number, the less sensitive it is, and vice versa. When you increase your ISO above a certain threshold, you can get better performance in low light conditions, but this increase in light detection level comes with a trade-off: image noise. In the current conditions of this studio, we have set our camera's ISO to the native ISO, which is the point at which the sensor achieves its best signal to noise ratio. In other words, this is the brightest the image can get without inducing noise. If we lower the ISO, the image will get darker. Likewise, if we turn the lights off and raise the ISO, the image will get brighter, until we have a usable level of light being picked up by the sensor, but the image is a lot noisier. It's recommended to keep your ISO at the native ISO of your camera, which in our case is ISO 400, although many cameras, such as our one, do have a dual native ISO, in this case 400 and 3200. How do these numbers work? The lowest number available on your camera is the base ISO. This is the lowest ISO level the manufacturer has decided is within the usable limits of the camera. On this camera, the lowest is ISO 100. As we increase the ISO, which goes up in powers of 2, the exposure of our camera doubles. So 200 is twice as bright as 100, and 400 is twice as bright again. Different cameras will have different maximum ISO settings, and in our case the maximum ISO available is 25,600, which is 256 times brighter than the base ISO, although this will increase the noise so much that the footage will quite often be unusable. There aren't many cases in which you'd actually need that much gain added during filming, but it's nice to know the option is there. It's also worth knowing that some cameras used in broadcast often use decibels as a measurement of sensitivity. This will vary per camera model as to which sensitivity measurement matches each decibel increment. Whether using ISO numbers or decibels, it's recommended to find your camera's native ISO, usually available on the manufacturer website, and stick to that when possible, using the aperture and lighting to determine the brightness. So that raises the question, what is aperture? This is the second method we can use to control the overall exposure of our shot and also change the look. When you watch TV and see a clip with the subject of the shot, maybe a person being interviewed, and the background is out of focus, clearly differentiating the foreground from the background, this type of look is achieved by adjusting the aperture to change the amount of light hitting the camera sensor. The aperture is a series of blades inside the lens body which can open and close to restrict the amount of light passing into it. When the aperture is closed, or slow, we can see our entire shot in focus. We have a deep depth of field, which is great for when filming scenes on a macro scale, such as filming a mountain range from a distance, but not so great when filming an interview up close, as it will lead to some pretty boring looking shots with no separation between the subject of the video and the background. In order to achieve this type of look, we can open the aperture to a fast setting, meaning more light is allowed to pass into the lens, reducing the depth of field. This means that when we focus on a subject, it will likely be the only item in the shot that's in focus, allowing us to direct the viewer's attention to where we want it. Note that as the aperture changes to a faster setting, allowing more light in, this makes the shot brighter, so you have to compensate for this, primarily by using lighting, but also with the option of using filters, which are the equivalent of sunglasses for a camera, a polarized glass layer in front of the lens glass, only allowing a portion of the light through to the sensor. The third and final way you can control the exposure of a camera is by using the shutter speed. In video, this is typically measured as a fraction of a second, such as 1/50th or 1/60th of a second for cameras using electronic shutters, and on film motion picture cameras using rotary disc shutters, the timing is measured in degrees. When we change the shutter speed, we change the amount of light that's reaching the sensor per frame. A faster shutter speed will make the image darker, and a slower shutter speed will make the image brighter. By adjusting the shutter speed, you can change the perceived motion blur of an image. In photography, the shutter speed would usually be as fast as possible to achieve a razor-sharp image with no blur whatsoever. However, if we do this on a video camera, the result can appear quite unsettling, and that's because 24 or 25 frames per second and their associated shutter speeds were adopted very early on in the cinematography industry because it introduces a very similar amount of motion blur to that of the human eye. If you wave your hands quickly in front of your face, then you'll naturally see that motion blur. A lot of the video we see on TV is filmed at 30 frames per second, and most movies are still at 24 or 25 frames per second, with some exceptions. Our YouTube videos, for example, are filmed at 25 frames per second, so we'll use this number in our examples. As a general rule, we want to keep the shutter speed to half the value of the frame rate. So a frame rate of 25 would dictate a shutter speed of 1/50th of a second. In the film motion picture terminology, this would mean our shutter angle is 180 degrees. They both mean the same thing. The sensor is being exposed to the light of our image for half the duration of one frame, 25 times per second. This gives our image a natural looking motion blur. To make this easy to understand, here's an animation of a sphere with a small cube on the top for positioning reference. Let's make the sphere rotate one full turn every second. That means it takes 25 frames to turn 360 degrees. With a shutter speed of 1/50th of a second, the cube on the top of the sphere shows motion blur. It's not a perfectly sharp image. In the time it takes for the sensor to capture the image, the cube has moved slightly. In this case, we're using a digitally simulated sensor, but it's using the same behavior. If we double the shutter speed to 1/4 of our frame rate, 1/100th of a second, the motion blur is reduced. The time taken to capture the image is shorter, so the cube has moved a smaller distance. If we double the shutter speed again, the motion blur is reduced further. Following on from that, what is frame rate? In digital cameras, this is the number of images that the sensor captures per second. This also determines the speed at which those images should be played back, both in the editing process and when the end user watches the video. If the playback speed matches the capture speed, motion in the video will appear natural and accurate. As mentioned earlier, this video is filmed at 25 frames per second, but there are many options to choose from, each with their own advantages and disadvantages. I can't actually play those frame rates as demonstrations in this video, as the overall frame rate of a video must remain constant throughout, but we'll come to an exception to that rule in just a moment. 24 or 25 frames per second gives a more natural look with motion blur and is often used in movie productions. 30 frames per second is usually used in television broadcasting, and 50 or 60 frames per second is often used in some online content such as YouTube videos, as well as in gameplay videos to provide smooth, flowing visuals. Any frame rates higher than this are pretty rare, except for use in scientific measurements or other ultra-precise recordings. So, as I mentioned earlier, you can only have one frame rate in a video except when it's a slow motion recording or time-lapse. In a slow motion recording, many frames are recorded per second, for example 120, and it's played back at a slower rate, such as 25 frames per second, giving the impression of time being slowed, as that 1 second's worth of 120 frames take 4.8 seconds to play back. In super expensive slow motion cameras such as those used by YouTube channel The Slow Mo Guys, tens of thousands of frames per second can be captured, and so when played back at a regular 25 or 30 frames per second, the motion has been slowed massively. On the opposite end of the spectrum, a time-lapse only captures a few frames per second, perhaps even one frame every few seconds, capturing a snapshot in time. And then when played back at a regular 25 frames per second, the motion is super fast, allowing for a video covering long time periods, such as a time-lapse of a city throughout the day and night in just a few seconds. Finally, we come to dynamic range. This is the ability of a camera to portray both the bright and dark sections of an image in equal quality. If the lighting on me is set to a high enough level to clearly illuminate my face, and I use a cheap point and shoot camera to film the shot, the camera will likely have a low dynamic range. This means you can adjust the sensitivity of the camera to be suitable for filming the subject, but the background of the shot will be too dark and will fall into the noise floor of the camera's image. If the shadows of the image are brought up in brightness, there's likely to be noise which will negatively impact the quality of the video. On the opposite end of the scale, if the brightness is correct for the background, the foreground lighting will be way too bright for a low dynamic range to be able to handle. We get around this problem by using a sensor with a high dynamic range, often referred to as HDR. Most professional cameras will have a high dynamic range, meaning they can adequately record both the dark and light sections of an image and retain enough information in both contrasting areas to be able to process the image without inducing noise. I hope you've enjoyed this video and that you found it helpful. If you now understand the basics of using a camera but you're unsure which camera to buy, then make sure to subscribe as our next video covers which type of camera would work best for you. If you haven't already seen it, then check out our review of the 16-inch MacBook Pro M1 Pro, which is certainly one not to miss. Thanks for watching, and you'll see us in the next one.